When Elizabeth Seton boarded a ship for Italy to save her husband's life, she had no idea she was sailing straight into the greatest spiritual upheaval of her existence. What began as a desperate act of love became a journey into the heart of Catholicism, a journey that cost her friends, reputation, financial security, and even her own children. Yet from that crucible of suffering rose a woman of unshakable faith, mystical intimacy with Christ, and a mission that would change American history. Elizabeth Ann Bailey was born on August 28, 1774, into the elegant world of colonial New York. She arrived in a house shadowed by grief. Her mother, Catherine, had been unwell, and within 3 short years Catherine died, leaving the little girl and her older sister Mary in the care of their father, the distinguished physician Dr. Richard Bailey. He was a brilliant man, but his brilliance shone in places far from the nursery. He was restless, moving between medical work and teaching, leaving the girls in the hands of relatives who loved them but could not fully replace the gentleness they had lost. Even as a child, Elizabeth felt that loss physically, like a coolness in the room around her, a missing presence. Later she would write that she often sought refuge alone, sitting by the window at dusk while the city quieted beneath her. She listened to the muffled hooves on the cobblestones, watched evening light glide across the harbor, and whispered small, half-formed prayers. No one had taught her to pray so intimately, not yet. It was simply the instinct of a child who sensed that someone must fill the spaces life had hollowed out. Her father remarried when she was still young, choosing Charlotte Barkley, a refined and capable woman from one of New York's oldest families. But Charlotte, though not cruel, struggled with Elizabeth's sensitive nature. She valued decorum, order, self-command. Elizabeth was imaginative, emotional, hungry for affection. Misunderstandings grew silently, like hairline cracks in the foundation of their home. Elizabeth learned to hide her tears until she was alone. She kept a small journal, unusual for a girl her age, in which she poured her thoughts with startling honesty. There were entries filled with longing for her mother, entries filled with resolution to become good, entries where she wondered what God is like and whether he notices a little one in a corner. Yet not all her youth was somber. Elizabeth loved nature with a kind of contemplative joy. She galloped on horseback along the outskirts of the city, felt her soul fill with that bright, windswept freedom only children know. She was intelligent, musical, and was drawn deeply to Scripture. She memorized long passages of the Psalms. Their poetry became the language of her soul. Once, when she was about 11, she slipped into the garden at twilight and knelt in the grass, praying words she barely understood except by instinct. "Thy face, O Lord, will I seek." The moment seared itself in her memory. She would later say it was her first conscious experience of God's nearness, not as an idea, but as a presence. A subtle mystical thread wove itself even then into her life, though she could not yet see how deeply that thread would pull. When Elizabeth was about 14, the tensions at home grew too heavy. Her father's marriage deteriorated, Charlotte withdrew from her stepdaughters, and Dr. Bailey, overwhelmed by professional burdens, decided that the girls should live with relatives. For Elizabeth, the separation was piercing. She felt abandoned again, but she also discovered a hidden strength, a capacity to endure sorrow without surrendering hope. In her loneliness, she turned even more fervently to Scripture and journaling. She wrote of wanting to give my heart wholly to God, though she did not yet know what that would mean. Life shifted dramatically as she entered young womanhood. Her father, seeking a calmer environment for her education and well-being, arranged for her to receive instruction through trusted family friends. This period allowed her to refine her musical skills, to cultivate a graceful literacy, and to move in the refined social circles of New York. It was in this world, poised between refinement and fragility, that she met the man who would change her life's direction forever, William McGee Seton. William, Will to his friends, was the son of a prominent merchant family, handsome, charming, and gentle. Elizabeth later wrote that his smile could unsettle the sadness in me. Their attraction was immediate, but it was the steadiness of his goodness that won her completely. He understood her vulnerability and treated it not as a flaw but as a treasure. Their courtship unfolded in long walks along the waterfront, in shared readings, in conversations that opened Elizabeth's heart to a new kind of joy. She wrote in her diary that she felt my whole soul drawn out in gratitude to God for him. They married in 1794, when Elizabeth was just 19. The ceremony, held in Trinity Church, shimmered with quiet beauty. Elizabeth felt her heart flood with hope. At last, she believed she had found a home. Their early married life was filled with a radiant simplicity. Will's business prospered. Elizabeth delighted in homemaking. Their family grew quickly with children she cherished with almost fierce tenderness. She was known to slip into the nursery just to watch them sleep, whispering prayers of protection over them. She embraced the Anglican devotional life fully, attending services with reverence and absorbing the scriptures with a contemplative intensity. But beneath the domestic happiness lay shadows that Elizabeth could sense before she could articulate them. Will's health had been fragile since youth. Sometimes he would stop suddenly while walking with her, pressing a hand to his chest, struggling to draw breath. She would reach for him, heart pounding, and he would laugh it off with a lightness that did not match the fear in his eyes. His father's business dealings, once secure, began faltering. Debts loomed. The responsibilities on Will's shoulders grew increasingly heavy. Elizabeth, though determined to support him, felt the first tremors of the storm that would soon engulf them. In 1798, her father, whom she had struggled to understand but deeply loved, died while serving the city during a deadly yellow fever outbreak. Elizabeth was devastated. She was 24, a young mother with grief layered upon anxiety. Yet she found herself drawn, not into despair, but into deeper prayer. She began spending long moments before an open Bible, seeking consolation in the Psalms that had shaped her childhood. In these meditations, she sometimes felt a kind of interior warmth, a wordless assurance that God saw her, that he was closer than the fraying edges of her life suggested. She confided in her journal that she felt held, as if by an invisible hand. These were the early stirrings of the mystical intimacy that would later define her spiritual journey. By 1801, the Seton business collapsed. Will, already weakened, could not withstand the pressure. His lungs deteriorated. Doctors suspected tuberculosis. Elizabeth watched him fade with a helplessness that pierced the core of her being. Yet even in sorrow, their love grew more luminous. On quiet evenings, she read scripture aloud to him, her voice trembling at passages about hope in suffering. He would listen with closed eyes, sometimes squeezing her hand as if holding onto the promise more than the words. When Will's physicians insisted that the only chance for his recovery lay in the warm Mediterranean climate, the Setons made a desperate and painful decision. Elizabeth would accompany him and their eldest daughter, Anna Maria, on a voyage to Italy. It was a bold act of love, leaving her young children in the care of trusted family and trusting everything to Providence. She boarded the ship with a sense of apprehension, but also with a flicker of faith that God was guiding them into something unseen. The voyage itself was grueling. Storms beat against the hull. Seasickness and fear marked the early weeks. Elizabeth stayed near her husband constantly, tending to his coughs, helping him breathe during the long nights when the sea's roar masked his labored gasps. But she also found unexpected moments of wonder, standing on the deck at dawn, watching the horizon unfold in silvers and pinks. She felt again that subtle nearness of God. She wrote later that the ocean became a vast cathedral, where every wave seemed to sing of God's grandeur. They arrived in Livorno in late 1803, exhausted but hopeful. Will's business partners, the Felici family, welcomed them warmly. The Felicis were devout Catholics, deeply spiritual, deeply charitable, and they were captivated by Elizabeth's sincerity and quiet strength. But tragedy struck almost immediately. Because their ship had come from a region suspected of carrying disease, the Italian authorities placed the family under strict quarantine in a small, cold stone building overlooking the sea. The walls were damp, the air bitter, and Will's health deteriorated rapidly in the harsh conditions. Those weeks of quarantine would become some of the most searing and transformative of Elizabeth's life. She nursed her husband tirelessly, lifting his thin body, warming his hands with hers, praying aloud as he struggled to breathe. Anna Maria clung to her mother, frightened by the echoing halls and her father's hollow coughs. Elizabeth fought her own terror with prayer, pressing her forehead against the stone wall at night and begging God to spare him, or to strengthen her to bear whatever came. She felt God near in that cold chamber, closer, she would later write, than ever before. At moments, she sensed an interior voice whispering consolation, not of deliverance, but of presence. I am with you. Sometimes, exhausted beyond measure, she felt a peace descend on her like a warm mantle. It was not the peace of hope fulfilled, but the peace that strengthens a soul for heartbreak. Will died in her arms on December 27, 1803. Elizabeth sat still for nearly an hour after his last breath, cradling his head against her shoulder, unable to release him. She prayed through her tears, asking God not why, but what now. In that prayer, a new chapter of her life quietly began, though she could not yet imagine its scope or its cost. After quarantine ended, the Felici family gathered her into their home with extraordinary tenderness. They offered not only comfort, but the first glowing glimpse of the faith that would captivate her soul. Their home was filled with images of Christ and his mother, gentle, sorrowful, serene, and for Elizabeth, grieving and spiritually raw, these sacred images awakened something deep within her. She felt as though she had stumbled into a world where God was not distant, but intimately present. She attended Mass with them for the first time, astonished by the reverence and the palpable sense of the sacred. When she saw Catholics kneeling before the tabernacle, believing with utter conviction that Christ himself dwelled there, her heart stirred with a longing she could not name. She found herself whispering, almost involuntarily, "My God, if this is true, let it be for me." And in that moment began the interior battle that would define the next great movement of her life. Elizabeth remained in Italy for several months after Will's death, sheltered tenderly by the Felici family. Their home became a sanctuary for her grief, yet it also ignited a spiritual upheaval she could neither ignore nor easily resolve. She had been raised in a refined Anglican world, where worship was dignified and restrained. The Catholic world she now encountered was warm, embodied, and full of mystery. The contrast did not frighten her, it fascinated her. It drew her the way a hidden melody draws someone who recognizes a tune they cannot yet name. The Felicis did not pressure her toward conversion, but they opened their faith to her naturally, as if inviting her into a family tradition rich with affection. She watched them gather each evening before a small home altar, a simple space adorned with a crucifix and an image of the Blessed Mother, and pray with reverence and heartfelt sincerity. Their devotion seemed effortless, rooted not in obligation but in a relationship she sensed but did not yet understand. One evening, she watched as the mother of the household knelt with her children, guiding their hands in the sign of the cross. Something in that scene pierced Elizabeth. She thought of her own little ones across the ocean, motherless now in all but name, awaiting her return. She felt a yearning rise in her, a desire to give her children not merely moral instruction but a living faith, one that could sustain them through trials as fierce as those she had weathered. Her inner turmoil deepened when she discovered the Catholic understanding of the Eucharist. The idea that Christ was truly present, body, blood, soul, and divinity, shook her soul like a revelation. She wrote to her sister-in-law Rebecca Seton with fervor, "How happy would we be if we believed what these dear souls believe, that God Himself is with them in the Blessed Sacrament." At Mass, she watched the priest elevate the host. She felt a longing so sharp it frightened her, as if her heart were being pulled toward a truth she feared to accept. But returning to America meant returning to Anglicanism, and she feared the disapproval of her family and the financial ruin that might follow conversion. The Catholic Church was tolerated but hardly embraced by the New York elite. To become Catholic would risk social exile, professional consequences, and the disfavor of loved ones. Yet the seed had been planted, and it grew rapidly. Before she left Italy, she confided to Antonio Felici that she felt God calling me to His church, though she did not know if she possessed the courage to answer. Antonio, with characteristic gentleness, urged her only to follow truth as God revealed it. He pressed into her hands a small crucifix. She held it tightly as she boarded the ship back to America, unaware of how often she would cling to it in the storms ahead. The journey home in 1804 was heavy with uncertainty. She traveled with her daughter Anna Maria, determined to reunite with her other children and rebuild some sense of normalcy. But her heart carried the imprint of Italy, the prayers, the masses, the silent presence of Christ in the tabernacle. More than once during the voyage, she found herself whispering the Catholic prayers she had heard, the words feeling strangely natural on her tongue. When she stepped onto the familiar streets of New York, reality struck with full force. Her community, though sympathetic to her widowhood, regarded Catholicism with suspicion. Even the possibility of her conversion unsettled them. Rebecca, who loved her deeply, pleaded with her to remain Anglican. Friends warned that the Catholic Church was foreign, superstitious, unfit for American sensibilities. Yet Elizabeth felt an undeniable pull toward the God she had encountered in Italy, the God who had met her in the depth of her brokenness, who had accompanied her through the nights of quarantine when her tears soaked the thin sheets around her dying husband. She began attending Mass in secrecy, slipping quietly into St. Peter's Church. The sanctuary was dim, lit by flickering candles that cast a warm glow across the wooden pews. As the liturgy unfolded, Elizabeth felt enveloped by a peace unlike anything she had known. During the consecration, as the priest whispered the ancient words, she felt again that mysterious interior movement, a stirring that seemed not emotional but spiritual, deep and unmistakable. She later wrote that the Eucharist drew my whole soul to itself. Still, she hesitated. The struggle intensified until it reached a moment of clarity one winter afternoon. She had been reading the Gospel of John, lingering over the bread of life discourse. The words struck her with sudden force. "Unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink His blood, you have no life in you." She closed the Bible slowly and pressed it to her chest. In that quiet moment, she felt as though Christ Himself were speaking directly to her heart, not commanding but inviting, with an intimacy that moved her to tears. She whispered into the stillness, "If you are here, I must follow." The decision was made. On March 14, 1805, Elizabeth Ann Seton was received into the Catholic Church. The moment was simple, without ceremony, yet it held the weight of eternity. As the priest poured the baptismal water and she renewed her vows of faith, she felt a profound cleansing, as though years of searching and sorrow were lifted in an instant. She received her first communion shortly after, and the experience became one of the defining mystical moments of her life. She wrote to a friend describing it with trembling awe, "At last, God is mine, and I am His." She felt a warmth spread through her being, not physical but spiritual, a sweetness that made her heart race with the realization that she had encountered the living Christ. She left the church that morning with her face wet from tears and her hands clasped tightly around her little crucifix. The world looked unchanged, yet she felt utterly new. But conversion came with consequences. Friends withdrew from her. Some relatives treated her with coldness. Invitations ceased. Most devastatingly, the small school she had opened to support her children began losing students because parents feared the influence of a Catholic convert. Her finances crumbled. She was left nearly destitute. Through all of this, she clung to God with unwavering faith. She wrote in her journal, "I am at peace, though all around me is storm." The Eucharist became her anchor. She attended Mass daily whenever possible, even walking long distances in harsh weather. On certain mornings, during the quiet minutes after communion, she felt again that interior nearness of God she had experienced in Italy, stronger now, more luminous. She described it as a whisper in the soul, a presence that enfolds me. These mystical consolations did not erase her hardships, but they strengthened her to endure them with serene courage. It was during this difficult season that a new path opened unexpectedly. Her spiritual director, Father William Dubourg, and his associate Father Louis William Valentine Dubois, saw in her not only piety, but an extraordinary gift for teaching and leadership. They believed she could help form a community of women dedicated to Catholic education, filling a desperate need in the young American church. They invited her to Baltimore, where she could teach in a Catholic school and discern whether God was calling her to religious life. Elizabeth hesitated at first. She was a mother, responsible for her children, and the idea of religious life seemed impossible. Yet she felt drawn to the possibility, not as an escape, but as a fulfillment of the love God had been stirring within her for years. With the encouragement of the Felicis, who supported her financially during that transition, she moved to Baltimore in 1808. Her arrival there marked the beginning of one of the most transformative chapters of her life. Baltimore was a different world from New York, less refined, more overtly Catholic, and full of missionary zeal. Elizabeth found herself energized by this environment. She joined the staff of St. Mary's School, where her warmth, intelligence, and spiritual depth quickly captivated the students. Mothers whispered that Mrs. Seton had a gift for awakening faith in children. Her gentle instruction, her patient guidance, and her ability to weave prayer into daily life made her beloved by all who encountered her. Yet something deeper stirred within her. During evening prayer in the small chapel, she often felt a burning desire to belong wholly to God, not simply as a convert, not simply as a teacher, but as a bride of Christ. She sensed a call forming within her, growing more insistent with each passing month. Sometimes, while kneeling in the dim chapel, she felt again that mystical warmth spreading through her heart, illuminating the quiet conviction that God wanted something more from her, something she could barely fathom. In 1809, Archbishop John Carroll, America's first bishop, formally approved the establishment of a religious community under her guidance. Elizabeth, with humility and trembling courage, agreed to lead it. She traveled to Emmitsburg, Maryland, where the Sulpician priests had secured land for the community. The land was rugged, the buildings unfinished, the future uncertain. But Elizabeth saw beyond the roughness. She saw a home where poor children could learn, where young women could grow in holiness, where Christ could be loved with undivided hearts. On July 31st, 1809, she pronounced simple vows, becoming Mother Elizabeth Ann Seton, the first American-born woman to found a religious community. The Sisters of Charity began with a handful of women, poverty that bordered on destitution, and a determination that bordered on heroic. They lived simply, prayed fervently, and poured themselves into their mission of education and care for the poor. Elizabeth wrote their rule of life, drawing inspiration from the French Daughters of Charity founded by Saint Vincent de Paul and Saint Louise de Marillac. Their days were long and filled with sacrifice. They rose before dawn for prayer, taught children from morning until late afternoon, tended the sick in the evenings, and returned to the chapel at night for meditation. Yet amid the labor, Elizabeth felt an exquisite joy. She believed God had led her through sorrow, not away from love, but toward a larger, deeper love. Sometimes, while kneeling before the tabernacle after a day of teaching, she felt enveloped by the same mystical warmth she had known since Italy, now fuller, richer, infused with a sense of divine companionship. "God is so near," she wrote, "that I fear sometimes to breathe, lest I disturb his presence." Her community grew. The school flourished. Young women came seeking spiritual purpose. And Elizabeth, who had once been a lonely girl pressing her forehead against the windowpane, became a spiritual mother to countless souls. But the cross had not finished its work in her life. New sorrows awaited her, sorrows that would refine her into the saint she was destined to become. The early years in Emmitsburg forged Elizabeth into a woman of profound spiritual intuition. She carried the weight of leadership, the labor of teaching, and the daily pressures of building a community with almost no resources. Yet anyone who visited the Sisters of Charity in those years would describe the same thing, a warmth, an atmosphere of peace, as if the walls themselves held something invisible but deeply alive. That atmosphere radiated chiefly from Elizabeth. She was not a stern superior. She was a mother. She guided gently but firmly, always emphasizing trust in God's providence. When their food stores ran dangerously low, she did not panic. She gathered the sisters before the small wooden tabernacle, whispering, "God is our Father. He will not forget his children." More than once, provisions arrived within hours. A donation of flour, a delivery of vegetables, a farmer riding up with a cart of milk. The sisters marveled. Elizabeth only smiled, as though these small miracles were simply God showing good manners. Her own children lived at the school, and she mothered them with tenderness while training them in a faith that had cost her everything. Yet this mingling of motherhood and religious vocation created sorrows she had not foreseen. Her eldest, Anna Maria, bright, sensitive, and spiritually attuned, began showing troubling signs of illness. A persistent cough, fatigue, moments when her breath caught painfully. Elizabeth recognized the symptoms instantly. Tuberculosis, the same disease that had claimed Will. She prayed with a desperation that shook her soul. She begged God to spare her child, even offering herself in exchange. But Anna Maria's health declined steadily. Some evenings Elizabeth sat beside her daughter's bed, holding her hand while Anna Maria spoke softly of heaven, of longing to see her father again, of trusting God's will. Elizabeth's heart broke and strengthened simultaneously. Here was the faith she had longed to give her children, but the sight of it flowering in suffering tore at her. In 1812, Anna Maria died peacefully, her head resting against her mother's breast. Elizabeth held her long after her final breath, as she had once held Will in that cold quarantine chamber. She whispered prayers over her, tears falling silently into her daughter's hair. That night, she went to the chapel alone. Before the tabernacle she knelt and said only, "Your will is a deep water, Lord, but you are in it." This quiet submission became the defining spiritual note of her later years. Though the cross returned again and again, she met each blow with a steadiness that astonished those around her. Her younger daughter, Rebecca, soon fell ill as well. Elizabeth sensed the pattern repeating, yet she refused to let dread consume her. She cared for Rebecca with extraordinary gentleness, reading to her, praying with her, comforting her through nights of coughing. Rebecca, like Anna Maria, possessed a contemplative purity, speaking often of trusting God and offering her sufferings for the conversion of souls. When she died in 1816, Elizabeth was once again plunged into grief, but it was a grief now tempered by a supernatural peace that seemed rooted in the very marrow of her soul. She wrote, "My God, what can I say except that you have taken again what was always yours? Only help me to love you better for it." Despite her losses, the Sisters of Charity continued to flourish. The rule she shaped blended the spirituality of the French Vincentian heritage with the needs of American life. She encouraged the sisters to cultivate simplicity, humility, and a joyful zeal. She taught them not only how to educate but how to listen, how to see the face of Christ in every child, especially the poorest. Under her leadership, the community became known for its compassion, its discipline, and its unwavering dedication to the Church. Among her sisters, Elizabeth exercised a motherly authority that combined wisdom and humor. She could gently correct a novice for breaking silence, and moments later tease another sister with warmth that eased tension. Her letters reveal a personality alive with wit, joking about spilled ink, unpredictable weather, or the misadventures of teaching, but always returning to the deeper themes of God's providence and the joy of surrender. She viewed every setback as an invitation to trust more deeply. Her mystical life grew richer, even as her physical strength waned. She recorded moments of extraordinary interior consolation during prayer, times when Christ seemed to draw near with almost palpable tenderness. His presence is like a quiet fire, she wrote, warming the soul without consuming it. She experienced these consolations most often after receiving the Eucharist. She would remain kneeling long after Mass, eyes closed, hands folded, her face softened by a radiance the sisters learned to recognize. They whispered among themselves that Mother Seton spoke to God, as one speaks with a friend. Yet Elizabeth never claimed extraordinary sanctity. She considered herself weak, flawed, frequently distracted. Her journals reveal the extent of her self-doubt. I am nothing, but God is everything. These confessions did not diminish her sister's reverence, they deepened it. They saw in her humility the unmistakable signs of a soul transformed by grace. In the mid-1810s, her health began to fail in earnest. The long years of poverty, sacrifice, and sorrow had worn her body down. Persistent fevers, a chronic cough, and episodes of exhaustion forced her to step back from active leadership, though she still met with the sisters and offered counsel whenever possible. She moved more slowly, leaned heavily on railings, and rested often. But her spiritual vigor remained undiminished. One evening, after a particularly taxing day, she gathered a few sisters in the small chapel. The twilight poured through the simple glass window, casting a soft glow across her face. She spoke quietly, her voice raspy but warm. We must live simply, my dear ones, loving God in everything. Trust, always trust. You will see, He never fails. Her eyes shone with that familiar light, a mixture of maternal love and mystical yearning. The sisters sensed that her time was drawing near, though Elizabeth herself rarely mentioned death. She focused instead on preparing her daughters, both the biological and the spiritual, for a future without her. Even in illness, she remained fiercely devoted to the sacraments. The Eucharist had become the axis around which her entire life turned. On mornings when she was too weak to rise, a priest brought communion to her bedside. During those moments, the sisters noticed an unmistakable transformation, a serenity that settled over her like a mantle. Sometimes she would whisper fragments of prayer, other times she simply closed her eyes and let tears slip silently down her cheeks. She once murmured, while clutching her crucifix, "At last, my Jesus, you are here. Oh, do not let me ever be separated from you." Her mystical experiences remained quiet, interior, infused with tenderness rather than ecstasy. She rarely described them aloud, but her journals during these years speak eloquently. She wrote of sensing a nearness beyond sight, a companionship that filled the loneliness left by the deaths of her husband and daughters. She said that God entered her suffering as a guest, softening its edges until it became not a burden, but a pathway toward Him. By late 1819, her illness, likely tuberculosis, had advanced significantly. She continued to guide the community spiritually, but each day left her more drained. The sisters began keeping vigil near her room, ready to assist her or pray with her at a moment's notice. Elizabeth accepted her growing weakness with gratitude rather than fear. "God has granted me the greatest of gifts," she whispered to a sister, "to die among my own." During her final weeks, she asked frequently to be read passages from Scripture, especially the Psalms. She lingered over verses she had cherished as a child. The same words that had comforted her in loneliness, sustained her through widowhood, and guided her into the Catholic faith. Her life, in a sense, had come full circle. The girl who once prayed alone at a window now prepared to die surrounded by daughters of her own choosing, daughters of grace. Her last days were marked by a profound inner peace. She expressed no fear of death, only a longing to see God and to be reunited with those she loved. She spoke softly, often repeating a simple prayer: "Be children of the Church, be children of the Church." It was her final instruction, her motherly legacy. On the evening of January 3rd, 1821, Elizabeth sensed her time was near. She asked for the crucifix she had carried since Italy, the same one Antonio Felici had given her years earlier. She held it tightly, pressing it to her heart. Her breathing slowed, grew shallower, and the sisters knelt around her, praying the litany of the saints. Elizabeth gazed toward the small window, where the faint winter light seeped through the glass. She whispered, "Jesus, Jesus," and slipped quietly into eternity. She was 46 years old. The sisters sat in silence, overwhelmed by both grief and awe. They felt as though heaven itself had drawn near in that small room. The woman who had carried so many crosses, who had lost so much yet given so much more, had finally gone home. Elizabeth Ann Seton left behind a legacy that reshaped the landscape of American Catholicism. She planted the seeds of Catholic education across the country. She formed a community of women whose charity touched countless lives, and she carved a spiritual path through suffering that became a beacon for generations. Her life was a living testament to the truth she clung to from childhood to death, that God is present, intimately, tirelessly present, even in loss, even in loneliness, even in the deepest shadows of the human heart. And for those who knew her, and for those who know her now, her story continues to whisper the same invitation that once captured her own heart: seek His face and trust.